Welcome to Eric's Perspective. Joining me today is the wonderful Lynne Thompson.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Lynne. Thank you so much again for being with us. It's an honor and a privilege to have you on the program. I should also add right up front, she is our Poet Laureate, for Los Angeles, City of Los Angeles. So
Absolutely.
Congratulations on that.
Thank you so much. You know, I do kind of feel, I was thinking as I was on my way here, I owe you a great debt of gratitude because early on you believed in me, you supported me, you let me read in the gallery, and it made all the difference to my confidence. So you're partially responsible if anything goes wrong.
Oh, thank you. I will gladly take that responsibility. That's so great. And I think everybody benefits as a result because they get to experience your poetry. And
thank you.
So thank you
again.
Thank
you so much.
Fantastic. So I thought maybe as a way to get started, perhaps you can just let us know, where were you born and raised?
I was born and raised in Los Angeles. I'm that rare native Angelino. My parents were immigrants from the Caribbean, came to New York, went to Chicago, and then ended up in Los Angeles. I'm actually their adopted daughter. I have 4 older brothers, and I think my mother very desperately wanted a girl, so voila, along came Lynn.
Excellent. So are your brothers also in Los Angeles?
They are. One of my brothers passed away in 2019, but the other 3 are all in Southern California. Yeah.
Excellent, excellent. And so how did you get started with poetry? What sparked your interest in the beginning?
You know,
or can you trace it back?
I can trace it back. I used to tell people, well, I started scribbling in high school until my sister-in-law corrected me, and she said, I still have the poem you wrote when you were 10 when I married your brother. Oh, I said, please don't show that poem to anybody. I'm begging you. Right? But when she shared it with me, it reminded me that I was always interested in language and words, and I was a voracious reader as a child, and my dad was a closet poet.
Oh.
My mom wasn't very encouraging of it. It wasn't a very practical thing in her mind.
Yes.
But he loved writing, did it more after he retired, but he would read me Langston Hughes very early on. He thought Langston Hughes was just fabulous. And so I think a lot of it came from an encouragement from him about language. He was very precise about language, about spelling, about how you spoke, all of that. So I really think my interest in it was sparked even when I didn't know it was being sparked.
Excellent. I think that's fantastic. So you mentioned Langston Hughes. Were there any other poets that stand out as an early influence?
You know, I think that Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven and Annabel Lee, I was listening to the rhythms of all of that and really taking that in. And when people ask me, well, what do you count as your early and biggest influences? I say, listen, I was raised on jazz, rock and roll, and the American musical theater. And when I go back and I think about the types of music I was listening to, I don't have a formal training in meter and what they call prosody, the study of poetry, but I was hearing poetry all along. I was hearing how rhythms work. I was hearing how repetition worked, how language fit together, how the meanings of words fit together. I was learning really through music and came into it that way. So when I went to put my first book together, I had a wonderful editor. But she was saying, you know, I think you're missing some of the formal elements that you need to include in your poetry. And it dawned on me, and I wrote her, and I said, you know what? It strikes me you're listening to Mozart, and I'm listening to Miles. and it's a different rhythm.
Sure.
And so before she put the book together, I flew back to Massachusetts where the press was located. And I said, I just want you to listen to me read the poems. And once I did that, she said, do whatever you want. I get it. I get how the music is working for you. And I'm hearing, I don't know, she didn't name a poet, but something in a more formal poetry than my jazz-inflected type of poetry.
I love that analogy, by the way, because there's something, as you mentioned, more formal about that art form of, like you mentioned, Mozart and so forth.
Right.
Whereas there's a more spontaneity, I would say, in somebody like Miles.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, you take in the rhythm of Nina Simone or even an Aretha, and you really listen to what they're doing, and you infuse your poetry with that kind of sound. It's not going to sound like Mozart. It's not going to sound like, fill in your famous poet, which is not a problem. I mean, those are great poets I admire, but it's not me. It's not my sound.
Right.
And I think when the first poem I wrote, when I said, okay, I think this is my voice, was a poem about my parents trying to make sure that their children understood the culture that they came from. Very small islands in the West Indies, St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And they were trying to save some of that for us. And when I finally heard that and put it in the poem, I said, that's my voice. That's the poet that I am, that's taking that culture and melding it into the culture I'm being raised in.
That's very interesting because in almost every art form there is that part of the artist's development where they're kind of admiring and listening to various artists and so forth, and then there's that moment when all of a sudden they discover their own voice, and that's what it sounds like.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, when that light goes off, you just think, oh, wow, okay, can I do this? Can I make this work for me?
Yes.
And it did work for me. So.
Wow, I'm getting chill bumps hearing you describe that. That's fantastic. Also, another thing I'm noticing is that music, you were using terms that are used to describe music, but also, by the way, used to describe visual arts as well, like rhythm and repetition and things like that. Absolutely.
I was thinking of you, knowing that I was coming for this conversation. It was a repeat, actually, but there's on HBO, I believe, a documentary on Black artists. And Glenn Ligon was on it, and Kehinde Wiley was on it.
I'm aware of that.
Faith Ringgold. Yeah. It's something Toward the Light, or
I don't remember the title.
I can't remember the title.
But David Driscoll was on it.
David Driscoll was the primary mover behind it. And it was fantastic, but they did talk a lot about the rhythm of the pieces. And there was one, I can't remember the artist, he saved all the piano pieces that were kind of stacked out in a yard somewhere and kind of built this mound. And he said he didn't know what he was going to do with them, but he just knew they needed to be saved. Kind of a John Otterbridge type of thing. And he put together this fabulous sculpture, but he said, I started seeing a rhythm in the wood. And I thought, that's it.
Yeah.
That's it. Right.
And that's one of the things I hope that this podcast does convey, the interplay between all the various forms of art.
Absolutely.
Different folks choose different ways of expressing themselves. And
absolutely.
For some, it's natural to express it musically. Some, it's poetry. Some, it's literature, etc. So anyway, I just think it's kind of cool.
Both types of art, both painting and music, show up all the time in my poems. And people have asked me about that. They said, "Oh, you're always either talking about an instrument or a singer, or you're having a conversation with Sam Cooke, or you're referring to." I did a piece in my first book on Robert Johnson,
the blues
master,
yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
And tried to put a musical bent into how the poem was written. And it was a lot of fun for me, and people have enjoyed that piece, I think, because it's both poetry, but they can kind of think about him and what he was doing. So.
Yeah. And one other thing, I just wanted to emphasize something you said earlier. So just because your poetry doesn't fit into the Mozart mold doesn't mean you don't like Mozart, or someone else shouldn't like it.
Absolutely.
It's just a different form of expression, that's all.
Absolutely. I was watching the Olympics, and one of the skaters was skating to a Debussy piece. That's one of my favorites. Yeah. So I think artists can appreciate other artists no matter what, even if it's not the way that they perform, or even their chosen genre.
Right.
I'm not a dancer, I'm not a musician, but that doesn't mean I can't appreciate those arts. Architecture. I'm just starting a book about a man who was collecting old guitars in the South, but then he was hanging them in trees like they'd been lynched.
Oh, really?
It's Freeman. Shoot, I'll have to send you the name.
Okay.
It's as soon as I saw it advertised, I have more books than I know what to do with. So I have to have that book.
Excellent. So actually, you not only have written poetry, but you've also written prose. Am I right about that?
Some prose, not as much as I hope to write, but I have started to write some prose. Think about maybe some short stories. Someone asked me, don't you have a novel in you? And I said, the great thing about poetry, 40 lines, you're in, you're out, you're done. I said, 200,000 words, not so much, right? So, but I'm starting to think about it a little bit more, and I've done some reviews, and I wrote, I guess what they would categorize as a creative nonfiction piece that was published online with beautiful artwork with it, because I was so concerned about the way the 1619 Project is being attacked.
Right.
Minimized. You can't teach it. And there's actually, as far as I know, this legislation is still pending that would defund any school that taught the 1619 Project. Any federal funds that any public school was receiving would be taken if they taught that project. And I'm like, are you crazy? What is wrong with you?
That seems so not only misguided, but like an overreach.
An overreach. And the students are saying, some teachers have reported, the students are saying, I know that's what the law says, but can you not teach us this anyway? Yeah. There was a program with Regina King. I can't remember it now. But the beginning shots of it are the Tulsa Massacre. Mm. And I had so many friends, both black and white, say, did you know about this? I said, I knew about it, but not because I ever learned it in school,
right?
But because I study history. I'm a student of history. And so, yes, I knew that this had happened. But there were so many people who were stunned to know that this had happened. So the other day on some news program, they were saying that the teachers in Tulsa are being told that they can say where Tulsa is, but they can't talk about the massacre. And so it's
That's
kind
scary.
of mind-boggling that. So a lot of my poetry now has really gone into trying to save history, what we've learned from history, because otherwise it's not the kids' fault if you don't teach them or direct them to the books.
Right.
How are they going to know? Right. So we're living in a very scary time.
I agree. When you were talking about that, it reminded me of the incident in Wilmington, North Carolina, in the late 19th century, where it's one of the few instances where a democratically elected government was literally overthrown.
It was overthrown.
And race was an issue in that situation.
And we just had that a year ago.
Yeah.
It's kind of hard to wrap your mind around, are these people trying to overthrow the government? But yeah, it happens. And I think America has been allowed to think it was exempt from those sorts of things, but we're not.
Or sweep it under the rug.
Or sweep it under the rug.
So that
never happened.
You never talk about it.
You never talk about it. What happened on January 6th was just enthusiastic political discourse, I think they said.
I couldn't believe that as a headline. I saw that and I thought, that's a really incredible way to describe it.
If we hadn't seen it with our own eyes, we might be inclined to believe that, some people were very heated.
Yeah.
No, they killed people.
Yeah.
So
going back now towards your development, I just want to take us back again. So now, let's see, you went to high school presumably in Los Angeles?
Went to Dorsey High School in Los Angeles, Scripps College in Claremont, part of the Claremont colleges.
Ah, okay. And what was your major in college?
Social psychology. Don't ask me why. I had some idea that I was going to help people, or I don't know what I thought. I really don't know what I was thinking.
Well, maybe, I don't know, maybe you were thinking, I know when I graduated with a degree in history, for example, and I love history, so that was like a nice fit.
Right.
But I was also thinking of maybe becoming a lawyer, and I understood that having a history degree would be a path. I don't know, were you thinking maybe along the lines? I know you ended up becoming a lawyer.
I ended up becoming a lawyer, but I really think that happened because, so I graduate from Scripps and I suddenly realize I have to be an adult now. That's not good. To pay my own bills, that's not good. And ended up working for a lawyer and thought, this is interesting. I could do this. Went to law school. If I had known myself better, I think I would have been an appellate lawyer because I was really interested in the way that the law worked as opposed to being a litigator.
I see.
But you and I were raised in the time of Perry Mason and the Defenders and all these lawyer shows.
Oh, yeah.
And you kind of thought, well, that's what you do.
It's exciting, you know.
It's exciting, and the person always confesses on the stand.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, it's fascinating.
And the wrong person inevitably was accused, and then they get vindicated in the end.
Exactly. Someone said, no, I did it. Yeah. It was great. That's not how it works. And I realized as I went on that I was really more interested in how the law worked.
I see.
And how it applied to people, and how where the court had found something incorrectly, or the jury, that I was interested in how do you apply the law to address that. And then literally one day I woke up. So I'm going along and I'm thinking, well, I'm a lawyer. I'm here now. And I woke up and I said, you know, the thing that's wrong with your life is you're not writing poetry. Literally. So I said, yeah, I can't be a lawyer and write poetry. There are many poets who have very high-powered jobs like that. Wallace Stevens, I think, comes to mind. He was a VP of an insurance company, but he would go home every night and he would write his poems pretty prolifically.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't working for me. You know, E.E. Cummings was a doctor, I believe. I think it was E.E. Cummings who was a physician. But that wasn't working for me. I needed another job. So once I realized I really wanted to do that, I started looking around, got a call from a headhunter who said, you know, there's this great job at UCLA. I think you'd be fantastic for it. And I said, I don't know. I've never done anything like that before. I'm not sure I'd be the right person. Hung up the phone, and then I realized, isn't this what you were asking for? Some other kind of job? Called her back. Long story short, I got the job, which freed me up to pay a little bit more attention to the writing. So that's really how I made the shift.
So that was kind of a transition. Once you got that job, you were able to turn back to the. So while you were a litigator, were you completely not writing poetry, or was it just so sporadic that
it was so sporadic it almost doesn't even count?
Yeah.
You know, occasionally I try to do something, but I wasn't focused on it. I wasn't reading as much poetry as you need to read to be a good poet. It's like anything else. Someone practicing the scales and practicing famous music on the piano, they're playing Debussy or whoever they're playing because you need to know how you got to this point, right? So I wasn't reading enough. I wasn't going to any poetry readings. I wasn't part of that community at all. And for me, I believe those are things that really contribute to your growth. At the end of the day, you have to do the work yourself.
Right.
But what really contributes to your growth is what you take in of the poetry world, like anything.
Sure.
You know, you study art or whatever it is, you need to be part of that in a deep and meaningful way to begin to start to see yourself doing that.
So as an undergrad, did you ever take any coursework in poetry?
Not in creative writing, but I took a lot of literature courses. All my electives were literature courses.
Oh, okay.
Why I didn't major in literature, I have no idea. Well, I think I do have an idea, because I didn't want to end up as a teacher.
I see.
I was pretty confident that was the one thing I really didn't want to do. A lot of teachers in my family. I had to do something different, be different.
Sure.
And so I think I thought mistakenly that if I majored in literature, I would end up teaching literature, and I didn't want to do that.
Right.
I really didn't want to do that. So I don't know what I thought I was going to do with social psychology, but that was kind of my thinking. And I look back now, and what we didn't have in those days that I would have loved to major in is the curator arts. Now they're starting to have more graduate programs in curation, and I think that would have been interesting.
So when you say that, you mean like curating visual arts?
Visual arts,
like
exactly.
Normally think of as a curator.
Exactly, because I was always interested in the arts. Even in high school, I would go to galleries, and I would always, because I couldn't do that. I didn't believe I could do that, so I wanted to see what others were doing. So that goes back a long way.
Oh, okay. And I remember in the early days of my own gallery, you were a frequent visitor to the gallery.
I was always at the Hanks Gallery. Do you remember me buying the Bearden?
I do remember that. very well.
That was, I was thinking about that, preparing for this, that you, I think, were the only gallery in town other than UCLA. So UCLA had the exhibit, and then you had many pieces in the gallery.
Yes.
And went to the gallery, and, lots of people were there and saw the piece. It's part of the Ithaca series.
Yeah, the Odysseus suite is what they call it.
And I said, oh, I think I'll buy that. And I remember I went to the restroom and I thought, are you crazy? What is wrong with you? You have no money. I said, you know what? I'm grown. I'm just going to go out there and say, I'm so sorry. I wanted to buy it, but and when I came out, BET was there. And they were interviewing black professionals buying black art.
Yeah.
They said, we understand that you just bought. I said, oh, well. So I was kind of stuck. And I was so grateful that I was stuck, because it is still over my sofa.
Oh, that's great
to
hear.
It will remain over my sofa.
That's fantastic.
And I love it. But yeah, that was a big deal to buy that piece. But now, of course, I'm so grateful I have it.
Well, that was fantastic. Actually, that brings back memories for me, because that does go back quite a ways in time.
That goes back quite a way.
Because I remember that show, and I remember, like you said, there was a show also going on of Bearden's work at UCLA.
Right.
And that's, he did that suite as collages and also as serigraphs, and that was great.
Yeah, it's the serigraph that I have.
And it was a
stunning.
And we should say, serigraph is a very involved art form. It is not, a lot of people mistakenly think, because it is in the category of prints, I'm just throwing this out for our audience.
Sure.
That doesn't mean it's a reproduction.
That's
it's actually
correct.
its own original work of art. He made a series of stencils, and from those stencils emerged this wonderful piece, a series of pieces, actually.
Absolutely. And that's when I learned through you about, if you wanted to start collecting, but, I wasn't in a position to buy a $50,000 piece or something, that a serigraph would be a good place to start. Legitimate piece of art by the artist you admired, whether famous or not famous, that is more affordable if you're just starting to get into that and trying to learn.
Exactly.
About, whatever. So that was a lesson that always stayed with me.
Exactly. And I'm so glad that you were listening, because, Bearden himself, along with other artists like Charles White and Elizabeth Catlett, they were very devoted and loved the styles of work they could achieve with those various methods, like serography, woodcuts and lino cuts, and that sort of thing.
And in this documentary we were talking about, it was interesting to hear David Driscoll talk about Romare Bearden coming to Driscoll's studio, and Driscoll was trying to kind of do a takeoff on what Bearden was doing. Mm-hmm. And he says, Bearden said to him, yeah, it's fine, but it's not you. And then he had some pieces, Driscoll had some pieces where he had torn the paper. And Bearden said, that's you. Where you're tearing the paper. And he was cutting or doing other things with his paper.
Yes.
He said, that's you, where it's ripped and you can see the edges. He said, that's your voice. That's not trying to be my voice. That's being your own voice. And that's an important lesson, I think, in all of the arts. We all have people that we admire and that we think, oh, if I could write like them. But make it your own. How do you make it your own?
Exactly.
How do you find your own way into that?
Exactly.
So it was good to hear him say that.
Yeah, and that's a lesson that cuts across all art forms.
All art forms. Yeah. Make it your own. You don't want to sound like Miles Davis. Miles sounded like Miles, and nobody else does.
Exactly.
So it's interesting, for example, to hear. I'm forgetting the pianist. His pianist.
You're not talking about
starts with an H. Herbie Hancock.
Oh, Herbie Hancock. Yeah.
To talk about how he had to develop his own musical place. Mm-hmm. That, of course, it was great to be with Miles, but how was he going to take his own ideas of music forward?
Sure. So. Absolutely. And another interesting little point about Romare Bearden, by the way, was that he worked full-time as a social worker for several years. Yeah. And was creating artwork at night, so to speak. So.
There are very few artists who can afford to live on their art alone.
Right.
I mean, until at some point perhaps, but certainly early
that's very
on,
rare.
It's very rare. They're either teaching or something else. I remember when my first book came out, one of my brothers said, so are you quitting your job? I said, what's wrong with you? So let me put it in a term you'll understand. Stephen King writes a book, and there's probably, to begin, 250,000 copies printed. I said, my little book, they've printed 1,000, and I'm very, very happy about that. I said, so that just gives you an idea of scale, you know. No, I'm not quitting my job.
Well, you know, it's so funny because I can remember, so I was representing the estate of Walter Williams and his widow. I never met him, unfortunately for me, but his widow was telling a story about the advice he gave to his son, and he was telling him, actually, advising him not to rely on his art for sustenance. And it was not just because it's kind of risky in terms of you might not be able to make enough money to survive, but he had another interesting point, and his point was that let's say you create something that resonates with the audience, and then they demand more of the same. The next thing you know, you're cranking out things to please people and make money, and you're not actually creating from the soul, so to speak. And that was an interesting point.
Yeah, that's a brilliant point. And I think that's easy to happen across art forms as well. You know, people didn't want Miles to change the way that he played. You know, we can think of artists, you know, playing different roles in theater or in movies. Oh, you were so good. We want you to always be James Bond. Well, gee, I thought I'd like to do something else. You know?
Oh, yeah. So and you hear artists of various stripes talk about that.
Absolutely.
They're like pinned in, typecast, if you will.
Typecast, you know, and they get stuck. The money's alluring.
Yes.
Fortunately for poets, I don't think people care much, although I have seen some poets that repeat themselves. And for that reason, for me, are less compelling. But I understand where that instinct comes from.
Sure. Because I imagine it's not just money, but it's like praise too, right? I mean, if you're getting praise for a certain thing, it could kind of encourage you to keep doing what you're being praised for, maybe.
Exactly. And it's the ego wants those strokes.
Of course.
You know, I have certain poems that people say, oh, please read that poem. I said, I've read that poem like 5 million times. I'm so sick of hearing myself read that poem. But they like it, and your ego likes hearing it. So, yeah, but you've got to force yourself to step out of your comfort zone and do something that's risky, that may or may not work. But at least you can say, I tried something different.
And you use the right word, I think, risk.
Yeah.
It can be risky.
It can be risky.
In terms of rejection. And
absolutely.
And then some people, I say people, some critics, some individuals who appreciate things can be kind of cruel and brutal in their criticism, too.
No question about it.
That little voice could be in your head somewhere.
We know we're a society that loves to build people up so we can tear them down.
Yeah, isn't that something?
They were so great yesterday, but today, not so much. So, yeah, there's always that.
So that actually leads me to a question I wanted to ask you in terms of what motivates what informs your poetry? You spoke about your parents being from the Caribbean. Basically, that makes them, I would say, immigrants to this country.
Absolutely.
Did that in any way play into? Does that in any way play into what drives you to write poetry?
I consider myself a storyteller who's chosen the genre of poetry to tell stories. I want to save some of that family history, as much of it as I can know or conjure, for the generations behind. We have 2 new babies in my family and another one that will be here next year, later this year, I guess.
Congratulations.
And they will never have known my parents. They won't know that they came from these tiny little islands unless someone tells them those stories. When I started writing, I would ask my brothers, because there's a big age difference between my brothers and myself. I like to remind them of that. I would say, what about this? And did you know this or whatever? And at first, they would say, I don't remember. I don't know. Over the years, they'll call me periodically and say, Lynn, you remember when you asked me about that? This is what Dad said, or this is what Mom said. So that I've been able to capture some stories, find documents. Now so much is digitalized online. So for example, I found the ship my father sailed on that brought him from Barbados to New York.
No way.
The ship, and it's in a poem, the ship had made this twice, every 2-week run between Brazil, stopped in Barbados, and went to New York. Did that for 5 years. It was decommissioned. When World War II broke out, it was recommissioned, and its first assignment was to go into Norway to evacuate the Jews in Norway.
Oh, wow.
The Nazis found out about it, bombed the ship, and as far as I know, it's still at the bottom of the Atlantic.
Wow.
I say all that to say, even when, and I tell my, when I do workshops, even if you don't know the whole story, there is so much online, libraries, military records, census records, that you can start to piece together these histories. In this case, there was a court hearing about what had happened to this ship, and that's where I got all the information about how it had started and where it ended up. So I was able to cut it down and put it in a poem to talk about my father sailing on that ship.
Oh my goodness, that is very...
So when you ask me what motivates me, a big influence on me has been the poet Natasha Trethewey, who was not only the Poet Laureate of the U.S. for two terms, I believe, and also the Poet Laureate of Mississippi, which is her home state. And she frequently, and she's not the only one who does it, but she was the first one that kind of turned the light bulb on for me, of braiding public history with personal history. And I try to do that a lot in my work. Okay, when this was happening to you, what else was happening in the world around you, and why is that important, or how does that braid into your story? Mm-hmm. So when I found all of this history through the Ellis Island logbooks have all been put online. And not for everybody, because it's not true for my mom, but for my dad, it had the ship he sailed on, a picture of the ship, the provenance of the ship. So for a poet, it's like, I found gold now. I got something to work with now.
I guess so, wow.
Yeah. So I'm really driven, long way around to your question, by family history, but also by forgotten, more and more so, by forgotten history.
Yeah.
Those things that people don't really know, or they focus on this big picture, but what was happening just behind that. Mm-hmm. So if I look at a painting, it's not just the painting, it's what brush was used, how is the composition derived? Why is it 5 musicians instead of 4 or instead of 6? Mm-hmm. I'm trying to ask other questions other than what's right in front of my face.
Very interesting. I was just curious, where was the ship when it got sunk? Rather.
It was off. The ship was sailing to Narvik, Norway. Uh-huh. I didn't even really think about there being a Jewish population in Norway. Tend to focus on what you're taught in school. It's all about Germany, going into Poland, and that. And so I was kind of surprised at that. But it was going into Narvik, Norway. Maybe there were about 2,000 people to pick up. And I can't remember the details of how the Nazis found out.
Right.
But so they were right off the coast or about to sail into the harbor there.
I see. And that's when
torpedo.
Torpedo.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And do you know what prompted your dad? There he is. He's on the Caribbean island, and he's thinking to himself, "Hey, what do I do now?" And he decides to come to the U.S. Do you know what made him decide that, and how he found out about this ship, for example?
I think he had no control over the ship. If he was going to come, he was going to sail.
Okay.
And that happened to be the ship that was available.
He couldn't even live. Just a coincidence.
Yeah, he couldn't leave from his island because it's so small. Barbados was big enough to take one of these.
I see. So he went from his island to Barbados.
He went from his island to Barbados, and then the ship sailed into New York.
Okay.
Into Ellis Island. I suspect, as I learn more and more from talking to different people, and I still have family in the islands, doing a little research, there's not any one answer to that. He was in his 20s. He was the equivalent of a high school principal down there, even though he couldn't get a job as a teacher once he came here because he didn't have proper credentials. Oh, wow. He did teach night school. They let him do that. But, people still drank that Kool-Aid of this is the land of opportunity, even though he plainly knew what life was like in the States for black people, Negroes, as he said at that point. So I think he came for better opportunity, among other reasons probably. I believe he was the youngest of 7, all sisters. But you never know in the islands. So those families are very mixed up down there. Sail, my mother said, they sail from this island to that island. You never know who the daddy is. I said, okay, well, let's not dwell on that too long, shall we? But it's true, unfortunately. It's true. So, yeah, there were probably a lot of reasons that he came.
That makes sense.
But
It's kind of understandable.
But, you know, it's easy to say, I'm going to go and live on an island like that. As an American, we're so used to all the stimulation you get that when you go there, as lovely as it is, and weekend you're like, well, where are we going? What are we doing? What's it? There's not that kind of stimulation, and it's a real twist. And I think he was an ambitious guy.
Oh, okay.
You know, I think he was a very, very ambitious person who thought, you know, I want more for my family. I want to see other things. I want to try things that I can't try in St. Vincent, lovely as it is.
And did he meet your mom in New York?
No. He was 10 years older than my mom. And I think at that time, early part of the 20th century, basically you could teach once you were out of high school. And he taught my mother. So like most immigrants, mother comes first. She was 10 when she came with her mother and her aunt to Brooklyn. Everybody came to Brooklyn. West Indians came to Brooklyn. And of course, when Daddy came 3 or 4 years later, you look up people that you know from the islands. So he looked up my aunt. I'm here, you know, whatever. I don't know the reason that they moved from New York to Chicago. I can guess a lot of different reasons, but I don't know for a fact why that was. My aunt is in Chicago and has a boarding house, and my dad comes and is living in the boarding house. So my brothers and I would tease my mom and say, that dog, so he's living in the boarding house, you're living in the boarding house. One of my brothers, the one that's passed away, interviewed my mom and said, so at some point, you and Daddy start dating, right? And she said, yeah, we went to a movie. And he says, and then what happened? She said, then we got married. And there's a long pause, right?
That's a pretty big leap, right?
It's a long pause, and my brother, who is, of all of us, maybe the most formal and reserved, said, well, it must have been a hell of a movie. So, yeah, wow, you know. Yeah.
And so how did they end up in L.A.?
This is Mother's version, and I'm working on a bunch of poems that are titled In This Version, Then Something Else, right? I think it is true that Daddy, who was slight of build, as so many West Indian men are, maybe he was 5'8", very slender, had asthma as a child, developed pneumonia in Chicago, and the doctor said, you gotta get out of this climate. This is not good for you here. Yeah. And, you know, go west. And so he drove to California with someone else in the boarding house, a Hispanic man. In a poem I wrote, I call him Mr. Rodriguez. I don't know if that's his name or not, but I do know he was Hispanic. He and Daddy drive to California. Mother at the time is in New Orleans. And I realize she's 19. She's beautiful. Suddenly she's married. She goes for a vacation. And I said, well, you know, I just, for some reason, said, how long were you there? I'm thinking vacations like we think vacations, 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. She said, well, 2 or 3 months.
Whoa.
I said, you left your husband.
In New Orleans, of all places.
In New Orleans, of all places. She went with her best friend, who was from New Orleans. And then I saw a picture of my mother at 19.
Yeah.
She's gorgeous. She's got the hair kind of cascading down the shoulder or whatever. And I said, of course, at 19,
right.
She suddenly realizes this is her first time on her own. She's either been with her mother, her aunt, or her husband. Now suddenly she's on her own, right? She's in New Orleans. So I said, well, abandoned Daddy. She said, I said, well, how did you get to California? So my great aunt, her aunt, follows Daddy to California, starts writing Mother and saying, you need to come here and be with your husband. Mother, yes, I'll be there any day now. And finally writes her and says, either you come or I'm coming down there to get you.
Whoa.
So Mother finally comes to California. So that's how they ended up in L.A. And I can so hear Mother saying, you know, when your father and I arrived, it was just orange groves and there was nothing. There's nothing here, you know.
So this was like not long after World War II, perhaps?
No, it was before that.
Oh.
They came 31 or 32. Huh. And before the war broke out, but during the Depression, they went back to the islands because you couldn't really get much work. And there was the dawn of radio, and my dad got very involved in radios. And so he said, let's go back to the islands. He always wanted to go back home. Mother never did. Let's go back. They have the two boys then, my two older brothers. And my mother said, there's only one problem. Your father thought he was going to work on radio. Then it turned out there was only one radio on the island. So your father took it apart and he put it back together. He took it apart and he put it back together. There's no money in that. Then she gets pregnant with my third brother, and she wanted him born in the States. She wanted him to be an American citizen.
I see.
So they came back.
Interesting. I was also curious. So the time they were in New York, you were saying they were in Brooklyn.
I think they were in Brooklyn, yeah, the whole
Do
time.
you know if they had any, because that's sort of around the time, I guess, or close to the time of the Harlem Renaissance and all the things that were going on there. Did they ever speak about Harlem at all?
They never really did. I don't know how long they were there.
Okay.
And probably, I do remember Daddy saying that he worked as a janitor at the Penn Station, I think Penn Station in New York. But Mother was a lot younger, so I don't think she would have had any recollection. Because when she came in 1920 and she was 10. So, I think that probably wouldn't have been so much on their radar screen.
I was thinking about what's going on now, right? For example, so you are the Poet Laureate for the City of Los Angeles.
I am.
And that occurred a year ago.
Exactly.
Can you talk about that? I mean, first of all, how long is the term of a Poet Laureate?
For the Los Angeles Poet Laureate, it's 2 years.
2 years.
So my term will expire, scheduled to expire December 30th of this year.
Of this year, okay.
In terms of how I got it, maybe you're asking about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would obviously they saw your talent and appreciated that for sure. I mean, that has to be like a prerequisite, I'm sure. But I was also curious. I mean, please tell us how you got it. But I'm also curious as to what exactly, if you could tell everybody what it is and what are the responsibilities or.
Absolutely, it's considered the literary ambassador for the city on behalf of the city.
Okay.
The Poet Laureate position is a joint program with the city and the LA Public Library System.
Okay.
So there's an expectation that you'll work closely with the library and give readings, give workshops. The only little problem is nobody thought about this little pandemic coming down the pike.
Yes.
So ordinarily, the Poet Laureate would be going hither, thither, and yon, talking to children, talking to seniors, doing all of that. Well, of course, now everything is by Zoom.
Right.
We're starting a little bit to go back into being in the public spaces a little bit, and we were kind of coming out of it between Delta and then Omicron hit. So that's been a bit of a challenge, but people are very creative, and the good thing about it for writers, not just poets, but all writers, all artists. I've noticed museums have put their collections online, so you can have virtual tours of collections, which is fabulous. You could never get to New York. Well, guess what? Now you can go on and see the Met collection,
sure.
Guggenheim collection, and the National Museum of Culture, African American History and Culture in D.C. You can see so much of their collections online, so that's a real gift.
That's a plus, yeah.
That's a real plus. And so the readings, gravitated to going online. So going back to the Poet Laureate, I've been doing a lot of work online.
Oh, fantastic.
A lot of readings online, workshops online. Arguably, you're supposed to write a poem for the city, but they haven't asked me yet. But I do have poems about Los Angeles specifically. So that's part of it. And just representing the city in any way you can with respect to all things poetry. So I've been working on some projects, the biggest of which, and the one I started right away, is called Poems on Air, which is a podcast, a weekly podcast. I read poems of other people and give a very short introduction into the poet, what they've accomplished, etc., and then I read the poem. And it's hosted on the LA Public Library website, as well as on Spotify and Apple Podcasts.
Oh, okay.
So people can tune in once a week. They're posted every Thursday.
Please, everyone, check it out by all means, and they can get to it by those means you just said. Spotify.
Absolutely. If they go to Spotify and put in Poems on Air, it should come up, or put in my name, Lynne Thompson.
Oh, okay.
It should come up with that. And the libraries, if you go to the website, not the collection, it's a little counterintuitive, but if you go to the website and put in Poems on Air, it'll come up.
Fantastic. And you do it once a week?
Once a week. And I am very happy to admit that I essentially stole the idea from our former U.S. Poet Laureate, Tracy K. Smith, wonderful poet, who had a program that I'm blanking right now on the name, but she did it every day.
Oh, wow. Big commitment there.
Wow, I don't know how. All I can think is she must have had people. Mm-hmm. She at the time was a professor at Princeton, and I was thinking maybe she had her students helping you, because what happens is you start doing the research for the poems that you want to read. Mm-hmm. Maybe you have a theme one month, maybe you don't. So for Black History Month, I'm reading all African American poets. You don't want the poem to be too long. You don't want the poem to be too short. You don't want the poem to have any words that small children couldn't listen to, because it's on the library's website,
sure, and
it's supposed to be for a broad audience. Right. So there have been poems I've looked at and thought, well, no nudity, no profanity, So you're really looking for what's going to work well on a podcast. I want to make sure that I can read it. So, for example, I was interested in reading some poetry of wonderful Native American artists, poets, but I'm so worried about butchering the pronunciation that I've decided against it. Not because the poems aren't fantastic, but because I want to be sure that I'm doing the poem justice. The good thing is the library is allowing me to do a periodic blog. So I will write about those sorts of things where, for whatever reason, I feel like I couldn't read it on the podcast. Mm-hmm. It was too long. It was, I'm not going to read a haiku. So how she did that every single day is beyond me. Or maybe she recorded, 20 of them at a time. Right. I don't know. But yeah, I couldn't do that.
I can understand.
So once a week is more than enough. It's more than enough. Yeah.
And when it was announced that you were the Poet Laureate, I understand you read one of your poems.
I did.
Called, am I right, Red Jasper? Is that?
I read, very good. I read Red Jasper. Absolutely.
And why did you select that particular one?
Because it's iconic LA. It's about the freeways in LA. The poem is based on a true event. I'm coming home one Friday night, regular Friday night, nothing special about it. Freeways packed. As I always tell people, if you live in Los Angeles, you have to ask yourself the following questions. Are the Dodgers playing? Are the Lakers playing? Are the Rams playing? Is it the Academy Awards? Is the president in town? You got to know all those things.
Of course, right.
In order to be able to navigate your way around, especially during traffic hour.
And God forbid there would be an accident.
And accident, car, 18-wheeler turned over, whatever. So we're coming home, coming south on the 5 freeway, turning north onto the 110 toward Pasadena. All the drivers, we didn't come to a complete stop, although I say that in the poem, but pretty close to a complete stop, because right in front of us was the biggest moon I had ever seen.
Oh, wow.
and found out later it's a harvest moon. It was orange, bright orange, and it looked like you could just reach out and touch it.
Wow.
And, I looked at the driver next to me, who also had the mouth just completely open. So it was a great opportunity to talk about driving on the freeway, talked a little bit about Dodger Stadium, talk about 18-wheelers, which drive us all crazy, and all of that, and then that you come around, heading towards the Arroyo Seco, and here's this moon.
Excellent.
So I just felt it was a very iconic type of Los Angeles poem to
it
read.
sounds very appropriate for sure.
Yeah, I wanted to share that one.
And also, I just want to point out that in this catalog, this is from a show that occurred in my gallery in 2003.
God, it's hard to believe it was that long.
Yeah, I mean, as I say the same thing. It's just incredible to think. But you have like two poems. Let's see, is it two
I think
or
I
more?
do have
no,
two.
more. You actually have three.
Oh, okay.
And one of them, though, is inspired by William Pajaud.
One of my favorite artists of all time, who you introduced me to, who was so sweet.
Yes.
Just the nicest man.
Yes, indeed. And it's one of his images that's on the cover of this particular
Absolutely.
catalog. And actually, the piece behind me is by him.
I noticed that.
And it's so appropriate for him because he always respected and admired his dad's performing as a trumpet player, band leader for various bands in New Orleans, speaking of New Orleans.
Right, right.
So,
and a lot of his paintings are very musically effective.
Exactly.
He's painting musicians. He's painting nightclubs or night scenes. So, yeah.
So once again, I just point that out for a number of reasons, but one of them is to show the interplay between the arts. I mean,
absolutely.
He's influenced by his dad, who was a musician. The music he played was an influential thing.
Absolutely.
And so Pajaud's art was influential in you, inspiring.
Very much so.
Are there any other visual artists that inspire your work as a poet that you can name?
I have written a poem, something of a collage poem, one might call it, which is perfect for this artist, Betty Saar.
Betty.
A true treasure, an icon for us here
Still
in Southern
with us,
California.
by the way?
Still working, just amazing. I saw her not too long ago. She looks fantastic.
In her 90s,
In her 90s, I think she's 94. And because she's an assemblage artist,
Yes.
that's the title of the poem, assemblage. And it's supposed to be interpreted as an autobiographical piece, but it uses titles of her work
fantastic.
to create a biography.
Well, that's fascinating.
So that's one influence. I do have a piece based on Juan Moreau's painting Dog Barking at the Moon.
Oh, my goodness.
And it's hopefully the reader or the listener will see a blank canvas become that painting as I talk about it.
I see.
Because I started out, the canvas is talking, and the canvas is saying, I see what you've done to these other canvases. What ideas do you have for me? And the poem is built on the painting appearing in the poem.
Oh, I love that.
So that was an influence. And I know I have others. I have one based on a John Biggers piece about one of those shotgun houses.
Yes.
Short piece based on that. So yeah, they show up quite frequently in my work. And sometimes, and I have one, I thought about you with this poem, one, another artist that you taught me to appreciate is Archibald Motley.
Yes.
So I have a couple of pieces that are based on him, on some of his work, those nightclub scenes. So yeah, it works its way into my poetry quite frequently.
I love that. And I also love the fact you're a collector of art. You appreciate art, visual arts, all the arts actually.
Yeah. But I have a pretty decent collection, I have to say. I'm very proud of it, and I think it was you who taught me. You learn these things. You realize you have a certain set of expectations or assumptions that are probably wholly wrong. And I remember saying to you, there was some piece I was admiring in your gallery, and you said, well, are you thinking of buying it? And I said, well, I don't have any more wall space. And he said, you rotate the art. I said, what? I'm done. My wall space is all filled up. He said, oh, no. He said, it's like clothing. You rotate the I'll never forget that because I hadn't really thought about it that way.
Yes.
This painting doesn't always have to be there. It could be someone, you're not done. He said, you said, you are not done. You are so not done. And I thought, oh my God. This is, and that was quite a revelation.
Yeah, no, it is so funny because a lot of the collectors that I interact with and talk to and sell to and so forth do just that. Yeah. And so I just thought that was a way to handle it. Although, most collectors will tell you, I mean, it's like they collect because they actually have to.
Yeah.
They can't not collect.
You can't collect. It's the way I feel about writing poetry. When students ask, do you ever worry about, writer's block? And I said, I don't believe in it. I said, you can't have writer's block. Well, suppose you don't have an idea. I said, when I don't have an idea, I write out longhand someone else's poem just to see how they did it, how it's working. I said, if you listen to it, that's one level of enjoyment. If you read it in a book, that's another level of enjoyment. If you write it out yourself and really think about the line breaks and how the music, that's something else for you as a writer that will inform what you do.
And it's so funny because you're anticipating a question I was going to ask you, and that is, what advice would you give writers and young writers and so forth? And to me, that's a very good piece of advice.
Absolutely.
Because I think everybody encounters that point where they feel, oh my God, what am I going to say now?
Right.
But that's a very, I think, interesting way of
And don't expect
it.
every poem to be the best poem you ever write.
You're
going to write 100 lousy poems to get one really decent poem.
Right.
And so the writer's block is because, you're afraid it's not going to be, the next Shakespeare. Nobody's going to be the next Shakespeare. Shakespeare wasn't the next Shakespeare because he was borrowing from Greek myth and all of that. So when you think about that, how is it possible to have writer's block? Just write out some words. Right. Look up some words you don't know. I just don't believe in it because all of those things, even if I'm not writing a poem per se, are going to end up in the project in the end. They're going to end up in the poem in some way because you've done this other kind of work and you read everything. That's my other piece of advice. Read everything. Read cereal boxes. Read throwaway newspapers. Read science magazines. If you're not a scientist, you will find something, and that language will show up in your poetry. That's my advice.
That's excellent advice. I like that, yeah. Before we end it, I do want to ask you if you would be so kind as to maybe read a poem or so, or two, or however many you want to read.
Well, I was looking at my poems, and I thought I should read something that's inspired on art. So why don't I read the one that was inspired by Pajaud?
Oh, that'd be great.
I think the name of the piece is The Rampart Street Ladies.
Ah, that was the one that's in the catalog.
In the catalog,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, exactly.
The house of many pleasures. It never matters what time it is in Rampart's house of many pleasures, 'cause there's always a scent of incense between the hours of bourbon and no goods. In the violet dusk, some cool papas with coin are always sniffing after us. They beg us to low-tone their bugles, slide their water keys, to shake our castanets. In the scarlet AM, some used-to-be somebody's mama always shows up asking after her Tom, Dick, or Harry, all the while memorizing the scent of our brass. But we're no diminuendos, and we cannot be riffed. There is no other, no Skylark nor sweet Lorraine. We're the blues the world forgets when we lie between a man's thighs, perfume of sin and reefer bleeding from our fingertips. We are wild cats for a sweet daddy. We bite when you beg us. Here in this Sidney Bechet dark, this fugue for the hardcore, we slide bronze and wet from Louis's horn at half-past dreams in this house of lethal delights, where you tell us your tawdry secrets, no matter what time, the violet dusk, the scarlet AM, where we taste of cinnamon, taste of clove, about the time that we surrender, about the time we slide you down, slow.
Brilliant. I love it.
So that was inspired by Pajaud's Pajaud's piece.
Excellent, excellent.
Because they're telling stories.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Oh, you're welcome.
And one last thing before we go, is there anything that you're working on or that's coming in the future you want to let everybody know about?
Well, I always have a million projects in my head. It's a matter of which one really grabs on and takes hold.
Sure.
I do have a group of poems that I hope to publish, a new collection of poetry, but it hasn't quite gelled yet. I tell the poems, talk among yourselves and get together, and they haven't gotten together yet. So I'm working on that. And I'd also like to put together an anthology of the poems I selected for the podcast, but with a little bit longer introduction of the poems, tentatively with this idea of why I chose them. There are a cajillion poems. Why did you choose these particular poems for your podcast? So I thought maybe a little essay, and then I would have to get permissions for the poem and all of that. But that's what I'm thinking about doing.
Excellent. Please, everybody, be on the lookout for that. And one final thing, am I right? You've been published, but do you have your own book of poems?
Yes. So I have 3 collections of poems.
Please let us know about those.
All of them, you'll be very proud of this. I've been very lucky and insistent about this. I wanted to have artists of color on all of my books. So the first one is Beg No Pardon. This is a piece by Richard Yard called The Ring Shout.
Excellent.
So that was my first book.
I love that piece.
My second book is Start With a Small Guitar. And this piece is by the artist Gronk, who lives here in Los Angeles. And he has used this figure, La Tormenta, for a lot of his pieces. She's always got her back to the viewer. But when I picked it out, I said, no, I got a little bit of a problem. I said, I can't have a white lady on my cover. I said, I can't do that. He said, that's not a problem. So as far as all he did was put some stripe of color on her back and on her arms.
I see that, yeah.
And so as far as I know, I have the only La Tormenta of color.
Fantastic. Okay.
And then I went to Scripps with Allison Sarr, and she's a friend, and told me that when you're ready, just come and pick out something. So she allowed me, and I need to open this up.
Oh my goodness!
Look at use this piece for the cover of my last book, Fretwork.
That is fantastic.
Isn't that fantastic? And I loved that the design, whoever designed the cover, whose name I should know, I apologize for that, was able to wrap the whole piece around.
That is great. So it kind of goes around to the back cover as well.
Exactly.
And we should say Allison Sarr is Betty Sarr's daughter.
Absolutely.
That is fantastic.
And a wonderful artist in her own right. Speaking of collaboration, so we both went to Scripps. She's got the 13-foot statue of Harriet Tubman in Harlem. She did about a 2.5-foot mock-up of it that she donated to the college.
To Scripps College.
To Scripps College. They wanted to start a sculpture garden, so Allison's piece was the first piece that they selected.
Oh, my God, that's
fantastic.
fantastic.
And they called me, and you'll love this story, actually. They called me and said, do you want to write a poem? We'll pay you. That's excellent. You never know if you're going to get paid as a poet.
Like a bonus.
It's a bonus. You and Allison can have this collaboration. Sure, I'll do it. So I'm doing my research about Harriet Tubman, etc. The poem is not coming. I called the college and I said, do you have the statue there? And they said, yeah. I said, can I just come out and see it? And they said, sure. So I'm sitting in the storage room with Harriet, and I said, girlfriend, you got to talk to me. Tell me something. I got to do this poem. Time is getting short. Went home that night and wrote the poem just like that.
I love it.
Sat with her for about an hour, looked at how Allison had constructed it or whatever, and the poem came that night.
I love it.
So
basically,
that's about collaboration.
I was going to say, that's great, and it's also a practical application of your advice, Absolutely. How to break the writer's block.
Exactly.
That is fantastic.
You got to figure out a way in.
Absolutely. This has been an absolute joy, Lynn. Thank you again for joining us and sharing your perspective.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad you have this podcast. I'm honored to have been a part of it. We have a lot of good memories, and I was happy that we could share so many of them today.
And thank you for sharing them, and it brings back fond memories.
Absolutely.
I'll treasure them forever. So once again, everybody, thank you for joining us, and don't forget to subscribe.